Just after 5 a.m. on July 9, 2009, 67-year-old Bud Billings poured some cereal into a bowl and then passed it to his 11-year-old daughter. Then he grabbed another empty bowl, filled that one with cereal too, and passed it to his 10-year-old son. This was Bud's favorite part of the day. It was like a cereal assembly line that he did with his kids every morning while blaring country music from a nearby stereo. It was really the only way to get breakfast on the table, because Bud had a huge family. He and his 43-year-old wife, Melanie, had 9 children, all under the age of 11 years old, who lived in the house with them. And all of them had special needs. Now, it hadn't always been that way, though. Bud and Melanie had gotten married 16 years earlier, and at the time, they'd had Bud's adopted son, Justin, and Melanie's 2 girls, Ashley and Nikki. And at that time, it was actually just Nikki who had special needs, and she required a lot of extra care. She had autism, cerebral palsy, and epilepsy. And unfortunately, just last year, she had died from a stroke, which had been completely devastating for the whole family. But, looking after her and caring for Nikki had really made Bud and Melanie want to take care of other kids with special needs too. Which was why, about 10 years ago, they had actually intentionally begun adopting children like Nikki. And once they started doing that, they felt so fulfilled and so happy about it that it had been really hard to stop. Bud looked over to where the rest of his kids were gathered around the table eating cereal. And it seemed like a lot, and sometimes it felt like a lot, but Bud loved his big, chaotic family and was really proud he was able to give these kids a home. And he made a good living as an entrepreneur and business owner, to the point where he'd actually been able to build this entire huge house for his kids. It had 9 bedrooms, so everybody could spread out and have their own space. And outside, they had a big fenced-in area with a whole setup, a slide, a swing, big trampoline. Now, the home was technically on the highway, but the driveway was so long, they couldn't even hear the cars. Plus, the town of Beulah, Florida, where they lived, was really remote anyway, and there weren't a lot of people around to even be driving on the highway. All that's to say, this big old house on the highway felt more like their own personal little fortress, especially when you consider the fact that Bud had an extensive surveillance system. He had a bunch of cameras inside and around the property to keep an eye on all the kids and make sure everybody was accounted for. And so Bud filled up the last cereal bowl and went over to the table, where his wife, Melanie, was busy breaking up a fight between their 2 youngest. Bud watched her very calmly end the argument without ever raising her voice, which was sort of typical of Mel. She was the most patient person he had ever met. As Bud sat down at the table, the phone rang, and Melanie got up to get it. Bud could hear the happiness in his wife's voice as she answered, so he guessed it had to be Ashley. Melanie's oldest daughter, Ashley, was 26 now, but she still called home at least a few times a day. Which, Bud didn't mind, but it did sort of make him a bit jealous. He wished he was as close with his older son, Justin, as his wife was with Ashley. He'd adopted Justin when he was just a baby, and he was 20 now, and so he'd basically had him his whole life. But for some reason, Justin, ever since dropping out of college last winter, really didn't seem interested in spending any time with his dad. Bud guessed it was just because he was embarrassed, or maybe there were some growing pains that came with adulthood, but it was still tough to feel that distance with his son. Just then, Melanie suddenly handed Bud the phone and told him that Ashley had a question for him, and Bud could guess what this was about. He owned an auto business and financing center, and Ashley had taken it over a few years ago so that Bud could slow down and spend more time with the kids. But he still helped her with problems as they came up. So Bud took the phone and asked her what was up, and sure enough, it was an issue about the business. And so Bud listened carefully as she described some billing issue that he did have an easy fix for, and then after they were done, they hung up and they both went about their day. Later that day, around 4 p.m., Bud went upstairs to his home office. The summer heat had finally broken, so he had spent most of the day outside with his kids. But their 37-year-old neighbor, April Spencer, was now downstairs helping Melanie out with all the kids, which meant Bud could finally break away and go get some work done. Even though Bud was basically retired, he'd been an entrepreneur all his life, and it felt sort of unnatural to completely stop working. So he'd sort of started a side hustle, financing used car lots. He also invested in other businesses, but he was picky about who he got involved with. Recently, he was approached about investing in a local karate company, but he had to back out because he wasn't really sure it could be profitable. Plus, the owner, Patrick Gonzalez, was friends with a man whose name was Cab Tice, and Bud hated Cab Tice. Now, Bud was a nice guy with a very clear soft spot for kids, but when it came to business, he never let people get the best of him. And Cab Tice had tried. Bud and Cab used to be partners, but then Cab had stolen a bunch of money from Bud. And the way Bud had handled it was to basically confront Cab almost every day, calling him all the time and demanding he pay him back. And so, on this particular afternoon, Bud decided he would call Cab again and demand his money again. So he dialed Cab's number, and he let it ring until it went to voicemail, which was not a surprise because Cab really never answered. Bud decided not to leave a message. Instead, he just hung up and made a few more calls to some associates at his car lots. It was around 5 p.m. when Bud went back downstairs to find his wife Melanie and his neighbor April in the kitchen, making some mac and cheese for the kids' dinner. April actually lived on their property in a trailer and was basically part of their family. Melanie and Bud had known her for 10 years at this point. She was also a registered nurse, so she was a huge help with their kids, who all basically had health issues. When Bud got down there, he thanked April and told her she could head back home now. He was ready to step back in. So they all said their goodbyes, and then the next 2 hours were just a blur of bath time and bedtime. Then it was lights out for the kids right at 7 p.m. Once the kids were in bed, Melanie went to clean up the kitchen, while Bud settled down in the living room and turned on the TV. And as he sank into the couch, he let himself feel the exhaustion of the day. He loved his life, and he was ready to do this all over again tomorrow. But still, he was tired. As Bud sat there on the couch, he began to doze off. However, his eyes shot right back open again when he heard a loud bang come from the front door. Instinctively, he leapt up, having no idea what was happening, but all he could hear were these loud, pounding footsteps charging through the house, headed straight towards him. 20 minutes later, around 7:30 p.m., Bud and Melanie's neighbor, April Spencer, made dinner in her trailer and got ready to relax for the night. And she'd just taken a plate out of her microwave when she heard a child's voice outside yelling. April was more confused than alarmed. I mean, it was typical to hear the kids next door, but usually, at this point, they were all in bed, asleep. And then before she could investigate, someone started banging on her trailer door and screaming for help. April rushed over and swung it open to see the Billings' 11-year-old daughter standing on her trailer steps, sobbing. She then mumbled through panicked tears that something bad had happened in her house. Seconds later, April sprinted towards the Billings home, which was only a short distance from her trailer. And when she got there, the front door was already open. She hurried inside to find the house very still and quiet, except for the sound of someone sobbing upstairs. She could tell it was one of the kids, and immediately she called up to them that everything was okay, she was here. But then April saw something that made her stop mid-sentence. On the floor of the hallway just outside the living room was a trail of blood. April gasped and started to panic when she realized the trail led to Bud and Melanie's first-floor bedroom, but she forced herself to slowly follow the blood and push open that bedroom door. And when she saw what was inside, she had to bite her lip to keep from screaming. She staggered backwards away from the room, then ran to call 911. Within the hour, at least 6 police units and a team of crime technicians were at the Billings' home, documenting the horrific scene and collecting evidence. Deputy Robert Guy climbed out of his cruiser in front of the house. So far, he'd been told that the homeowners, Bud and Melanie Billings, had been found shot to death inside of their bedroom. And before even stepping 1 foot inside of this house, Guy already had a theory. So he had been with the Escambia County Sheriff's Department for 6 years, and in his experience, when a couple was found dead at their home, it was always a murder-suicide. But even if that was what happened here, Guy had never worked a case like this before, because he'd also been told that 9 young children lived inside of this home, and they were actually in the house during this shooting. They had all been found hiding around the house during the initial police sweep, and they were now standing outside by a police cruiser wrapped up in blankets. There was an adult woman standing with them, and Guy could see that all of them, the woman included, were either sobbing or staring off into space, clearly in shock. Guy felt this wave of sympathy come over him. These kids were too young to go through something like this, and so the more time he could give them to process, the better. So instead of speaking to them first and forcing them to sort of confront what had just happened, he decided his first move would just be to go into the crime scene and have a look around. Guy headed towards the house and entered through the front door. And the first thing he noticed was there was a big boot print on the wood of the door, and the sides of the door were all splintered. This door clearly had been kicked open. And so seeing that told Guy that his murder-suicide theory likely couldn't be true. Someone else had forced their way into this home and committed this crime. Guy asked a tech to take a photo of the door. Then he went inside to do an initial walkthrough of the first floor. There was some blood in the front hallway, and even more of it soaked into the living room carpet, where there was also a bullet hole in the floor. So at least part of this attack must have happened here. Guy then headed to the primary bedroom where he'd been told the bodies were. And the first thing he noticed in there was that there was a lot of blood soaking into the carpet, and there were also a bunch of shell casings on the ground. Bud's body lay at the foot of the bed face down, and when Guy approached, he could see that Bud had been shot multiple times, including at least once in the head, and he also had a zip tie on his left wrist, and so clearly at some point, the killer must have tried to restrain him. Melanie was by the closet on her back, and also she had gunshot wounds in her head and chest, and she did not have any restraints on, and so she had either cooperated with the killer or was just shot first. After looking at Melanie, Guy's eyes moved over to the closet right nearby, and it was wide open, and he saw inside the closet there was a very clear square impression in the carpet on the floor. It looked like something very big and heavy had been removed from that spot, possibly by the killer. And so this gave Guy a new theory. If something had been stolen from this room, that suggested this was a robbery, and maybe Melanie and Bud had just gotten in the way. So Guy left the bedroom to do a full walkthrough of the whole house, including the upstairs, with this theory in mind. However, he didn't actually see anything else that pointed to a looting or a robbery. Big-ticket electronics and jewelry were still in the house, and so was a safe that was upstairs, which of course could mean his new theory that this was a robbery was wrong. Or it could mean this was a robbery, but the robber had only been looking for something specific that they knew was in this house. Like, for example, whatever that heavy square object was that had been at some point sitting in the closet in the bedroom that left that impression in the carpet. He really wanted to know what had been in there. So he figured now was the time to go outside and actually speak to the kids. Moments later, Guy was standing with the Billings kids and the woman who was standing with them. The woman said her name was April, and that she was the one who called 911. As April spoke to Guy, she kept glancing over his shoulder at the kids to make sure they were okay. And Guy did too, because even though he wanted to speak to these kids, he knew he had to tread very carefully. Not only were these kids likely very traumatized, but anytime law enforcement interviewed young kids, it had to be done with precautions like with a specialist or trusted adult. So for right now, he was just starting with April. Her voice shook as she explained how one of the Billings' daughters had come to her trailer and then also what she had actually seen when she went inside their home. April said she lived on the property, but she hadn't seen or heard anything strange before going over there. April also told Guy that she looked after the Billings kids a lot, and that they actually had two other older kids, Ashley and Justin, who did not live in the house with them. And so she gave Guy their numbers and said somebody was going to have to call them and let them know what happened. Guy immediately headed over to some officers and asked one of them to get in touch with Ashley and Justin, not only just to notify them, because that was obviously necessary, but also because these two likely could have critical information about this case. And in a domestic murder like this one, loved ones were always the first people Guy looked at as potential suspects. Just then, Guy turned and saw a flash of headlights coming down the driveway, and soon a car pulled up and a young couple jumped out. The woman was frantic and headed right for the kids. When some officers tried to stop her, she shouted that her name was Ashley and those were her siblings. Guy rushed over, and she said again to him who she was, and also that the man she was with was her husband, whose name was Blue. Then she breathlessly explained why she was there. She called the home earlier, and the kids answered, screaming that Mom and Dad were shot. She had been the one who told them to go to April's. She had also called her brother, Justin, who was on his way too. But she said she still didn't know. Were her parents okay? Had they really been shot? As gently as he could, Guy told her what happened, and he watched as Ashley collapsed in Blue's arms. A few minutes later, after Ashley had hugged the kids and calmed down enough to speak, Guy pulled her aside to ask her a few questions. She was still having a hard time catching her breath by this point, but she managed to explain their family situation. Melanie was her mom, and Bud was Justin's dad, and the other kids were their adopted siblings who were adopted by Melanie and Bud. And so Guy let Ashley talk about her parents and her siblings for a few minutes, and then at some point, he asked her the question that had been bothering him. Did Melanie or Bud keep anything valuable in their bedroom closet? Ashley looked confused, and then said, her parents had a safe in there, but inside of it was just documents and some sentimental pieces of jewelry. Nothing financially valuable. She said they did have another safe that was upstairs, and that one had a lot of cash in it, maybe around like $200,000. Guy hurried to write this down, and as he did, it just didn't make any sense to him that this killer potentially had taken a safe from the first floor that had nothing valuable inside of it, but then left the safe upstairs that potentially was full of money. But Guy wasn't really confused. It was more like he was excited, because now he was thinking the killer must have inadvertently taken the wrong safe. And so if this was true, it meant that whoever did this knew enough about this family to know that Bud and Melanie did have a safe. But the killer apparently didn't know enough to know that there were actually two safes in the house, one with money and one without. So, very likely this meant the killer was, somewhat close to the family, but not that close. Which made it unlikely that Ashley and her husband Blue, Ashley's brother Justin, and even April the neighbor were suspects. However, before Guy was going to eliminate anyone, he really needed to speak to the kids. So he asked Ashley if she would help him do that. About a half an hour later, Guy watched as Ashley and Blue coordinated with April to bring the kids away from the scene over to Ashley and Blue's place. By this point, neighbors had gathered outside and everybody was just standing there watching the scene in total shock. It had proven to be very difficult speaking to the kids because they were kids and they were terrified and many of them had disabilities, which also made it difficult for them to speak. However, during his conversation with the kids, Guy had been able to learn one huge thing. One of the girls happened to look out the window right before the murders and saw a red car parked outside. Now, she wasn't able to give Guy much of a description of this car other than the color and that it was a bigger car, like an SUV. But a large red car was distinct, and Guy had already asked some officers to put out a message to patrols to keep an eye out for it. He also had officers speaking to the neighbors, but the Billings lived on a pretty remote patch of land, so he doubted anybody had seen or heard anything because they just lived too far away. And so Guy had just decided to wrap things up for the night when he saw another set of headlights appear from down the driveway. Seconds later, a car pulled up and a young man got out, and then he hurried toward the house. An officer stopped him, and Guy could see that at that point the man began to look around and then jogged over to Ashley and the kids. Ashley gave this young man a big hug, and then she began to cry into his shoulder. Guy guessed this young man had to be Justin, Bud's older son, who Ashley had said would be coming. But even though he was only a few feet away, Guy thought there was just something off about him. He didn't appear to be shocked or even really upset at all. He's just arrived at a crime scene where his parents had been shot to death and he seemed sort of unfazed. But actually, less than being unfazed, it was more like he was sort of nervous. He kept furtively looking over at the police and then the home and sort of fidgeting a little bit. Now, like Ashley, Justin was very likely quite familiar with this house, and also the location of the safes and what was in them, and certainly might not have needed to force entry if he was going to come in here and rob the place. But Guy just had a feeling that something was up, and so he went to speak to him. And as he took the few steps over to Justin, Guy saw Ashley suddenly push herself away from Justin with what appeared to be a very urgent look on her face. When Guy reached the group, Ashley was just shaking her head almost incredulously, saying out loud that she couldn't believe she hadn't thought of that. Then Justin turned to Guy and said, "Has anybody checked the cameras?" Guy froze and asked what he was talking about. Justin told him that their father had cameras in basically every room, and he knew where the recordings were kept. Guy couldn't believe that nobody had noticed these cameras all around the property this whole time. But regardless, if they were there and were as extensive as Justin claimed they were, this was huge. And also, offering up this information suddenly made Justin's behavior seem a whole lot less suspicious. If Justin was on those cameras, he certainly wouldn't have mentioned them. But Guy still wanted to interview him at some point in a more controlled environment to get a better read on things. So, before he ran off to tell the crime techs about these cameras and the tapes, he asked Justin if he would come to the station tomorrow, and Justin agreed. Around 8 p.m. the following day, Guy was sitting in his office staring at his desk phone. And he was feeling really antsy because his case had taken a huge turn in the last few hours. And now he was waiting on a call that he hoped would be the first step in wrapping this thing up. He still didn't have the surveillance footage, which would take a while. There were 16 cameras located on the property, and crime techs were still going through all the tapes. They also hadn't found any fingerprints at the crime scene either. However, they had used the bullets and the shell casings from the scene to figure out that the murder weapon, the gun that was used to kill Melanie and Bud, was a 9mm. It was information Guy could later use to connect to suspects. Guy had interviewed Justin earlier that day, and even though the 20-year-old had still acted way too casual for someone whose parents had just been violently murdered, Guy didn't think he was actually a solid suspect. For one, there was no motive. Even though Justin admitted that he and his dad were not on great terms at this point, he didn't seem angry with his dad. He also had an alibi. He was at his friend Greg's house for dinner that night, and Guy had confirmed it. And Justin knew about the two safes and which one was more valuable, just like Ashley had. But what Justin had given Guy was a suspect, a man named Cab Tice. Cab used to be Bud's partner, but then he apparently stole from Bud's business, and Justin said he had actually seen his dad and Cab arguing over this money, and how Cab still had not paid Bud back. And so if Bud had any enemies, Cab was very likely one of them. It had taken all day, but Guy had finally tracked down Cab at his used car lot in a town that was located about 20 miles away from the crime scene. And since this lot was actually in a different county, Guy had to ask some deputies from that precinct to go over there and see if Cab was actually there. And so now Guy was just waiting for their call. And a few minutes later, he finally got it. One of the deputies rang him up and said they were at Cab's, and Guy would never believe what they found him doing in the back of the parking lot. He was cleaning out a red SUV. Within the hour, the deputies brought Cab to the station. Now, they couldn't bring the red SUV in or even search it because Cab had not given permission. So Guy would have to see what he could learn from Cab himself. And as soon as Guy sat down across the table from Cab, he instantly knew, Cab Tice was the kind of guy who always had an answer for everything, like the red car. Cab said he was cleaning it because he was going to sell it tomorrow, which sounded way too convenient. But Guy let it slide. And instead, he asked about Cab's relationship with Bud. And to Guy's surprise, Cab launched into a tirade. He said he hated Bud. Everybody did. Because Bud nickel and dimed everybody he did business with, even though he was rich. And it was common knowledge he literally carried around a briefcase full of money, like 20 grand, whenever he was doing business deals. And so Cab told Guy about all these people Bud had screwed over, like him and his friend Patrick, who had been relying on Bud to invest in that karate company before Bud apparently pulled out over profitability. And then at some point, Cab said if he was being honest, Bud probably deserved to get murdered. Guy couldn't believe what he was hearing. I mean, Cab had just admitted to despising a murder victim, and also he admitted to knowing that this same murder victim kept cash in his house. So the next thing he asked Cab for was an alibi. But Cab had an answer for that too. He said he was over at this other used car lot meeting about a potential business deal, and he said that lot was about an hour and a half away from the Billings' home, and he gave Guy the number for the people he had been with when he was over there so Guy could call and confirm it. And Guy just got up and left the room to do just that. And like Cab said, his business partners confirmed he really was there during the time Melanie and Bud were killed. And so when Guy hung up the phone, he was frustrated. He had felt sure that Cab had to be involved, but there just was not enough evidence to keep him here. So Guy headed back towards the interrogation room to tell Cab he could go home, but before he got there, he noticed one of his detectives running down the hallway towards him. And when he got to Guy, the detective told him that after looking through hours and hours of footage from the Billings' house, they had found something that Guy needed to see. Late on July 10th, over 24 hours after Bud and Melanie Billings were murdered, Guy and another detective sat in front of a TV in silence, watching footage from the Billings' home surveillance system. The shot they were looking at was from an outdoor camera, and it showed a red vehicle pulling up to the home around 7 p.m. Now, the license plates were covered, but Guy could tell this vehicle was not the same one Cab Tice was caught cleaning. The vehicles were both red, but this, in the video, was a passenger van, not an SUV like the one Cab had. And so this, along with Cab's alibi, meant they had virtually no evidence that Cab was the killer. But Guy quickly forgot about Cab, because what he saw next on this video shocked him. 5 people wearing all black, gloves, masks, and carrying guns jumped out of the red van. They immediately split up and without hesitation ran to different points outside of the home. And then the footage inside the house showed these intruders entering from 3 places: a bedroom slider door and a back utility door, both of which must have been unlocked because none of those were forced open, and then of course the front door, which was kicked in. They all stormed into the living room where Bud was watching TV and where Melanie soon appeared. There was no sound, but Guy could see them talk to Bud before one of them shot the floor. After that, some of them zip-tied Bud's wrists, and then the one who fired at the floor then shot Bud in each of his legs. And then after that, they dragged the couple down the hallway to what Guy assumed was the bedroom, where they disappeared. And unfortunately, there were not any cameras in the bedroom. Shortly after that, Guy saw on some outdoor footage the 5 intruders reappearing, leaving the house now with a safe, and then they drove away in the van. The whole thing happened in less than 10 minutes, and they were only in the home for maybe 4 minutes. After watching this footage, Guy just leaned back in his chair, feeling completely stunned. All along, he'd been thinking this was a robbery gone wrong, but what he had just watched seemed more like a military raid. It involved what appeared to be a sort of ruthless precision that seemed out of proportion for this small-town family home. But now, Guy knew he must be missing something crucial about the Billings' family. It could be that maybe Bud was involved in some kind of criminal enterprise, and the extreme security at his home was to protect the family from his various shady associates. If that was the case, it was more likely this was some kind of hired hit done by professionals, and the safe was just stolen to cover up what really happened. And if that was true, it changed Guy's entire case and basically made all of his suspects viable again. Cab's alibi was now worthless. The fact that he was not physically at the crime scene didn't matter, because maybe he hired a hitman. Similarly, just because Justin and Ashley knew which safe had money didn't matter either, because again, they could have hired hitmen to do this. But now, in order to narrow it down, Guy, of course, needed to find the killers, the supposed hitmen. And since he now had an actual image of the killer's red van, he decided he would release it to the public in case anybody in the area had seen it. The next morning, Guy was at his desk drinking some coffee. He just released the image of the red van to the public, and now he was just waiting for local tips to come in. In the meantime, he'd also been looking into other areas of Bud and Melanie's life to see if there was anything that explained the apparent trained team of assassins that stormed their home. And he found out that Bud used to work in the strip club scene, and he was known as a local investor for businesses in the area. But Guy didn't see how any of that connected to the murders yet. And all of his initial suspects, who he'd just put back on the table, were off of it again. He'd learned that Cab Tice was basically homeless and living at the used car lots that he worked at, which certainly gave him a motive for robbing and killing Bud, but no means. Because if Cab was broke, it was unlikely he could have afforded one hitman, let alone 5 well-trained hitmen. And then as for Ashley and Justin, even if, that safe had been stolen as a decoy, to show that it couldn't have been them because, they knew where the money was, well, there was still no clear motivation for either of them wanting their parents dead. Guy knew that Ashley had taken over operations for Bud's business, and so, perhaps she wanted the whole business to herself. But with her parents' death, it meant that she, sort of by default, would become in charge of her 9 siblings, which was going to be a lot of work and stress, and so Guy wasn't really sure that that trade-off made any sense. As for Justin, he just didn't seem like he had enough anger to want Bud or Melanie dead. Plus, he was the one that literally pointed out to Guy that there were cameras all over the house. And so it was doubtful he would send hitmen to a home he knew was littered with surveillance cameras, only to tip the police off to go look at the camera footage. But just then, an officer poked his head into Guy's office and told him that a woman had just called the tip line, and she believed she had actually seen that red van in her neighbor's backyard. An hour later, Guy, along with another detective, stood in the backyard of a home in Pensacola, Florida, located about 15 miles away from the Billings' home. This house belonged to the neighbors of that woman who had called their tip line. Basically, they were at the house where presumably this red van was located. A couple lived at this house together, but right now, only a woman was home, and she gave the detectives permission to go look around the property. And sure enough, in the back, the detectives found a red passenger van parked behind a shed. The van was missing its license plate, and also there were all these patches of black spray paint all over it, like somebody had been trying to alter its appearance. At some point, the other detective wandered away from the van and began walking around, and then a minute later, he yelled to Guy to come over and look at something. And so Guy jogged over, and he saw there was this burned out fire pit right in the backyard, and when Guy looked inside of it, his jaw dropped. At the bottom, in the ashes, was a pile of partially burned black clothes, just like the kind of outfits that the killers were wearing in the footage. Guy turned to look at the home they were standing behind. At this point, Guy knew they had to get that van towed, and they had to bring the couple who owned this place in for questioning, because that couple either knew who killed the Billings or they had done it themselves. It would be a few hours before Guy finally spoke to the husband of the woman who had let them into the backyard, and when he did, that man told him everything. Based on multiple confessions and surveillance footage, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Bud and Melanie Billings on the evening of July 9th, 2009. Around 7 p.m., the killers stormed into the Billings' home. As they did, they could hear their 4 other hired accomplices running through the house as well from where they had entered, and the killer knew they would all congregate in the living room as planned. They had all practiced for this moment for a month, so everybody knew exactly what to do and what their role was. They were ready, and their execution would be flawless. So the killer ran into the living room, and by the time they got there, their other accomplices had arrived there too. And so the team of 5 swarmed Bud, who had been watching TV, and they also grabbed Melanie as she ran into the room screaming. The killer then struck Bud and demanded to know where he kept his money. But Bud said he didn't have any, which the killer knew was a lie. Because it was practically common knowledge that Bud kept a lot of money in his home. That was why Bud had so much security and lived in the middle of nowhere to protect his money. And so the killer was not going to let Bud lie his way out of this. And so they pulled out their gun and fired a warning shot right into the floor. That way Bud and Melanie knew they were serious. Bud flinched, but when the killer asked the same question about the money, Bud still said he didn't have any. And that's when the killer became enraged. They coldly ordered their accomplices to tie Bud up. And then once he was, the killer walked over and shot Bud in the leg. And even though Bud began screaming and so did Melanie, the killer, calm as can be, just asked their question again. Where is the money? But amazingly, again, Bud gave the same reply. And so the killer aimed his gun at Bud's other leg and shot that one too. At this point, Bud and Melanie are screaming at the top of their lungs, and the killer and their accomplices just grab Bud and Melanie and begin dragging them down the hallway towards the bedroom. And when they got into the bedroom, the killer smiled, because the closet door in the bedroom was open, and they could clearly see there was a safe sitting inside. And so the killer told their accomplices to go get some duffel bags ready. They were about to get their cash. And so once the accomplices were gone to get their bags, the killer was alone with Bud and Melanie. And they turned to Bud, who by this point was writhing in pain but quiet, and they asked Bud to open the safe. But through gritted teeth, Bud claimed there was no money inside of it, which made the killer even more furious. How could Bud still keep lying? And so the killer, without even thinking, put their gun right up against Bud's face and shot him through the cheek. Bud fell to the ground, shocked by the blow, but still very much alive. But the killer walked over they aimed their gun at Bud and fired several more times. Melanie began screaming right behind them, and so the killer turned and demanded that she open the safe. And when she didn't either, the killer shot her multiple times as well. When the killer's accomplices returned, they knew they were going to be shocked to see Bud and Melanie dead. This was not part of the plan. And the killer was anxious too. They really had not expected this to happen. But the killer thought, you know what? It doesn't matter. We don't need Bud and Melanie. They could just take the safe and break it open later. So together, the accomplices and the killer hauled the heavy safe out of the home and into the waiting van. 10 minutes after they'd arrived, the killer and their accomplices drove back down the Billings' long driveway, eventually returning to their father's home, where they parked the van out back and burned all the clothes that they had worn during the attack. Finally, after all that, the killer went home. And as they were driving, they thought about the safe that they had stolen, and how relieved they were that finally they had some money for their business. It would turn out the person who organized the robbery and eventual murder of Bud and Melanie was one of Bud's former business associates, Patrick Gonzalez. Patrick owned a karate company, and at one point he had tried to get Bud to be an investor. And initially, Bud seemed interested. And for a moment, Patrick felt like all his financial problems were about to go away because here comes Bud with all his cash. But then Bud backed out, citing, lack of profitability. And after that, the karate business failed. And so suddenly, Patrick was desperate for cash and simultaneously feeling very burned by Bud. And like everyone who did business with Bud, they assumed that Bud was very rich. Patrick knew Bud had a huge house, and also he had this state-of-the-art security system, sort of reinforcing the idea that, behind the walls of this home, there was great wealth. In reality, the reason Bud had a big house and had the security system was just for his kids. He'd worked hard to build them this big, safe house. But to Patrick, he was convinced Bud had potentially millions of dollars stored in that home, and he was going to get it. So, before the murders, Patrick asked his father, Leonard Gonzalez, and a group of men he knew from working at a mechanic shop to help him rob the Billings. And under Patrick's guidance, using his self-defense knowledge, the group trained for a month to pull off what they thought would be a very smooth, efficient heist. Killing the Billings was never a part of the plan. It was just about taking the money that Patrick had convinced them all was going to be in this house. However, Patrick had become enraged once he had confronted Bud and felt like Bud was lying to him and further, insulting him, and so he had killed the couple. And so after Guy and his team found the van at Patrick's father's house, police brought the father, Leonard, in for questioning, and very quickly, he turned his son in. Patrick Gonzalez was convicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder and was sentenced to death. As for his father, Leonard Gonzalez, he received 2 17-and-a-half-year sentences, and the other accomplices involved in the attack got between 22 years and life. While this is just speculation, it's believed that the reason Bud and Melanie did not give up the code to that safe is because they knew in doing that, the killer and the accomplices would see there really was no cash in there, and they wouldn't stop until they searched the whole house and found their cash. And they knew that their cash was actually located upstairs in the second safe where their children were. And so very likely, Bud and Melanie essentially died, ensuring that these intruders never went upstairs and so did not harm their kids. As for the 9 kids, they were raised by Ashley and her husband Blue, who eventually moved into the Billings' home. On January 16, 1984, 43-year-old Kay Swartz sat down to dinner with her 51-year-old husband Bob and their kids, Larry and Annie. The kitchen of their split-level home had a window that looked out into the backyard, and they could all see snow falling outside. The Swartz's neighborhood in Cape St. Clair, Maryland, a suburb of Annapolis, was quiet and secluded, but the snow made it feel even quieter and further away from the rest of the world than usual. And Bob worried that if the weather got any worse, he might have trouble driving into work the following day. But then he heard Kay starting to pray, so he looked away from the window and bowed his head. Kay finished her short prayer, and then the rest of the family said Amen, and then they all started eating. Dinner time with the family was always Kay's favorite part of the day.
Ever since she was young, she dreamed of having a close-knit family that sat down together every night to share a meal and talk about how their days had gone. And now, Kay's dream had come true. She watched as her 17-year-old son Larry and her 9-year-old daughter Annie dug into their dinner, and she looked over at Bob and smiled. Bob took a drink and then smiled back. Dinner with the family was his favorite time too, because just like Kay, he'd always wanted to have a house full of kids. In fact, it was Kay and Bob's shared love of family that had first drawn them to each other when they met in graduate school at the University of Maryland 16 years earlier. At least that's what they told all of their friends. The truth was, the first thing that had drawn Bob to Kay was her looks. The first time he saw her in one of the campus parking lots, he couldn't stop staring. Kay was 5 foot 10 inches tall with long legs and a long neck, her brown hair was cropped short, and she had a perfect smile. Bob thought she looked like a model. And Bob, generally speaking, did not have the confidence to talk to women who looked like models. He was short and stocky, and he'd lost most of his hair in his early 20s, which had always made him a little insecure, but once he'd seen Kay, he couldn't stop thinking about her. So when he saw her again eating lunch in the university cafeteria, he took a deep breath, walked right up to her, and started a conversation. And Bob would always be happy that he'd taken that risk, because he and Kay had hit it off immediately and discovered they had a lot in common. They were both devoutly religious, they believed education was the key to success, and they put their love of family above all else. And so, soon after that first meeting, they were spending as much time together as they could. And within a few months, they were already planning their future together. But not long after they'd gotten married, Kay learned that she was not capable of having children of her own. This made her feel like a failure, like she was letting Bob down, and that their dream of having a big, happy family would now never come true. But after Kay and Bob spent time talking and praying together, they started to look at this seemingly bad news as a sort of gift. They decided that if they couldn't have kids of their own, they would adopt and provide a loving home for children who had never been fortunate enough to have families of their own. So, in 1973, they adopted Larry when he was 6 years old. And when Larry arrived, he felt like he was the luckiest kid in the world. He had spent his childhood in and out of foster care and never felt like he had parents, but now Kay and Bob had taken him in, and he was sure he had found his forever home. And Larry was everything Kay and Bob could have hoped for in a son. He was sweet, polite, fun to be around, and he even enjoyed going to church with his parents. Larry's adoption was such a success that pretty much right away, Kay and Bob began talking about adopting more children. And 6 years after Larry joined the family, Kay and Bob adopted Annie from South Korea when she was 4 years old. Annie, like Larry, was just incredible to be around from the moment she arrived at their home. Her smile was infectious, and she was smart, curious, and always happy. Bob and Kay adored Annie, and Larry made it his mission to be the best big brother he could possibly be to his new sister. So, back in the present, in 1984, while Kay ate her dinner with her family that night, she was very happy with how her life as a mother had gone so far. But, deep down, she couldn't help but feel a sense of loss, because there was one empty chair at the dinner table where Kay and Bob's third adopted child used to sit. Less than 2 years after Kay and Bob had adopted Larry, and about 4 years before they adopted Annie, they adopted another boy named Michael. At the time, Michael was 8 years old, about 6 months older than Larry, and Kay and Bob hoped the two boys would become fast friends and soon grow into devoted brothers. But Michael struggled to adapt to his new life. His birth parents had abandoned him when he was an infant, and by the time he was adopted by Kay and Bob, he'd already lived in 6 different foster homes and developed a serious distrust of authority figures. And as a result, Michael clashed with his adoptive father, Bob, right away. Mainly because Bob could be strict, especially when it came to school. And when Michael struggled in school, Bob would yell at him and ground him, and this would cause Michael to act out. And while Kay wasn't as strict as Bob, she was still a high school teacher, and she took education very seriously. So she couldn't understand why Michael didn't even seem to care about his grades. But when she tried to talk to him about it, he would get frustrated with her, and before long, they'd be shouting at each other. From the beginning, things between Michael and his new parents just didn't seem to be working out. And when Annie joined the family in late 1978, the Michael situation got much worse. Michael accused Bob and Kay of loving Annie more than they loved him, And Michael just seemed to go out of his way to start arguments with his parents, which made life very challenging for everyone in that house, especially Larry. Because all Larry wanted was for everyone to be happy and to get along. And so, when Michael fought with Kay and Bob, Larry would try to talk Michael down and keep the peace. But Larry, who was sweet and soft-spoken, rarely had any luck calming Michael down, or getting his parents to go easier on Michael. It was like both sides were unwilling to compromise on any issue. As Michael got older, the arguments between him and his parents became more frequent and more heated. And when Michael became a teenager, he started getting in trouble at school for fighting, and when he got home from school, he would yell and scream at his parents almost every day. Around this time, Kay and Bob started to feel like they had totally lost control of their second son. Then, on a night in 1980, when Michael was 14 years old, the tension between he and his parents reached a breaking point. That night, Michael had asked Kay and Bob if he could go hang out with some of his friends, but they had told him no, that he needed to stay home and do his schoolwork. Michael was furious, and after screaming at his parents, he just snuck out of the house and met up with his friends. But when he got home later that night, Kay and Bob were waiting for him by the front door, and they told him that they had had enough of his bad behavior and that he was not allowed to come back inside. And they didn't just mean for that night. They meant forever. They were disowning him. The following day, Kay and Bob contacted social services, and Michael was taken away and sent to a reform school, which is an institution where youth offenders are sent as an alternative to prison. Kay felt absolutely terrible about this decision, but with Michael now gone, at least Larry and Annie would hopefully have a happier, healthier, and less disruptive home. Now sitting at the kitchen table, staring at Michael's empty seat, Kay tried to remind herself that that decision she and her husband had made a few years earlier had been the only decision they could have made. After all, they had recently learned from social services that Michael, who was now 17, had had to be moved from the reform school to a mental institution because of his erratic behavior. And so, at least to Kay and Bob, this only seemed to prove that Michael would not have worked out long-term in their family. But deep down, whenever Kay thought about Michael, she couldn't help but feel like a failure. That night, after dinner, Bob got up from the table and headed to his home office that he'd set up in a small room located in the basement. Bob had gotten in on the ground floor of the growing computer industry, and he enjoyed the work and the money it brought in for him and his family. But the job sometimes required him to do work from home late into the night. And Kay knew that once Bob disappeared into his basement office, there was a good chance the rest of the family would not see him until the following morning. So Kay cleared the kitchen table with Larry's help, and then she and Annie headed upstairs. As Kay helped Annie get ready for bed, Larry came into Annie's bedroom and said goodnight to her before he walked back into the hall and headed for his own room. Kay gave Annie a kiss, said goodnight, and headed out into the hall just a moment after Larry had. Annie heard the sound of her brother's bedroom door shutting, and she heard her mother walking down the stairs. And soon after that, Annie's eyes got heavy and she fell asleep. But then, a couple of hours later, at around 11:30 p.m., Annie suddenly woke up because she heard what she thought were the sound of voices in the hall right outside her room. So Annie rubbed her eyes, climbed out of bed, and stumbled to her door, still half asleep. But when she opened her door, she realized the voices were not coming from the hallway, they were coming from downstairs. And the voices she heard were not people talking, but rather people screaming. Annie took a step into the hall, and instantly the screaming stopped. But Annie was still very worried and wanted to know what was going on, so she slowly walked downstairs, but when she got down there, the first floor was quiet and deserted. And as she stood there looking around in the dark, she suddenly thought she heard something outside the house. So she walked through the living room to a sliding glass door that looked out into the backyard where she heard the sound, and the moonlight, it was bouncing off the snow and created just enough light for Annie to get a good look at the backyard. And what she saw out there terrified her. In fact, Annie, after seeing it, she would turn and run back upstairs, dive into her bed, and pull the covers up over her head. And as she lay there, she told herself that this could not be real, that this had to be a bad dream. The following morning, Annie woke up and the house felt cold and quiet. She thought about what she'd seen the night before, but she was sure now that it really must have just been a nightmare, because if it hadn't been, if it had been real, wouldn't her brother or parents have come and got her and told her what was going on? Feeling somewhat reassured by this thought, Annie got out of bed and walked into the hall. She called out for her parents, but no one answered, so Annie walked downstairs to see where people were. But when she didn't see or hear anyone on the first floor, she started to get scared. So Annie ran back up the stairs to Larry's room, she opened the door, and she found him asleep in his bed. She shook him awake, and when he rolled over, she told him that she couldn't find their parents. Larry could tell that Annie was definitely scared, and so immediately became the big brother and tried to calm her down by telling her everything was okay and that their parents likely had just gone outside for a minute and they'd be back soon. Then he climbed out of his bed, took his little sister's hand, and together they walked downstairs. But when they got downstairs, Larry happened to look out the kitchen window into the backyard, and when he did, he stopped moving. He pressed his face against the glass and squinted to get a clear view of the yard, and when he did, his eyes went wide, and he instinctively reached over and covered Annie's eyes with his hand so she couldn't see what he was seeing. Then he picked his sister up and he ran to the phone to call 911. And as he ran, neither he nor Annie seemed to notice the red drops all over everything. A 31-year-old detective from the Anne of Arundel County Police, named Gary Barr, arrived at the neat little home in the quiet suburban neighborhood, and right away, the officers who'd already responded to Larry's frantic 911 call led the detective into the family's backyard. And when Detective Barr got out there and saw the scene, he just stopped and stared. Like Larry, the detective had a hard time processing what was in front of him. Detective Barr was a former Marine, and he'd seen some gruesome things during his time in the military, but he'd never seen anything like this. The ground in front of him, about 10 feet away from the sliding glass door at the back of the house, was covered in a dark red slush, from where massive amounts of blood had mixed with the snow overnight. And just beyond the bloody slush, a few feet ahead of him, he saw a dead body partially covered in fresh snow. The detective took a deep breath of cold air, then slowly circled around the blood-soaked part of the yard and approached the body. The body belonged to Kay Swartz. She was lying face down in the snow, her neck was covered in blood, and she was completely naked except for having a sock on one of her feet. Barr directed a few members of his team to remain in the backyard to take photos of Kay's body and to further investigate the area. Then he walked through the backyard to the open sliding glass door that led into the house. And on that glass door, Detective Barr saw part of a bloody palm print that the officers who'd first arrived on the scene had discovered as well. Barr knew the print was a significant clue, but at the time, in order to learn anything from the print, the police would have to send samples to the FBI forensics lab in Washington, D.C., because the FBI had the technology to run the appropriate tests. Detective Barr spoke with other officers nearby to confirm that the samples would be sent off quickly to DC, but Barr knew even if they got sent today, it would be weeks before they would hear anything from the FBI. And so Barr was not willing to pin the hopes of the entire investigation on this palm print that could even turn out to belong to the victim and not the killer. And so Detective Barr stepped through the door into the house to begin looking for more clues, but once again, as soon as he was inside, he had to just stop and stare at what was in front of him. There were pools and streaks of dried blood on the floor leading from the back door where he was to the living room. And when Barr stepped into the living room, he saw blood spatter all over the walls. He still had no idea what had happened, but he knew whoever had done this had been filled with rage during the attack. And the blood didn't stop in the living room. Barr found more splatter on the steps nearby that led down into the basement. So Barr followed that path of blood and eventually wound up in the small room in the basement, Bob's office. And once inside, he saw blood everywhere, and in the corner on the floor was Bob. He was deceased and had obvious cuts on his hands, chest, and neck. As members of the investigation team photographed and searched Bob's office, Detective Barr wandered back through the house and then walked out the front door. He hoped the cold air outside would help clear his head. He was in shock at what he'd seen inside the house because things like this just didn't happen in safe, quiet neighborhoods in Cape St. Clair. Barr stood there just breathing in the fresh air for a minute, and then he walked across the street towards one of the Swartz's neighbors' houses. When Barr had arrived at the crime scene, he'd told one of his officers to take Larry and Annie to this neighbor's house and to wait for him there. And so when Barr walked inside that neighbor's house, the officer was there with the two kids. Larry was wearing a pajama shirt, jeans, and high-top sneakers, and Annie was in a long nightshirt. As Barr approached the children, he saw Larry holding Annie's hand, gently consoling her. Larry was a relatively small and skinny kid, but it was clear to Barr that Larry was trying to act big and strong for his sister's sake. Barr walked up to the kids, and he first turned to Larry, and in a calm voice, he asked the child if he had noticed anything unusual the night before. Larry apologized and said he couldn't be much help. He told the detective that he'd gone to his room not long after dinner, looked at some notes from his Spanish class, and then went to bed. He didn't hear or see anything until the following morning when he and his sister had gone downstairs together to look for their parents, and that's when Larry had looked out the window and seen his mother in the snow and dialed 911. Then, without Barr asking, Annie suddenly lifted up her head and said that she had seen something the night before. Barr immediately crouched down to get to Annie's eye level and then asked her what she had seen. Annie told him that she'd woken up in the middle of the night because she thought people were talking outside of her room. But then, when she went into the hall, she heard screaming coming from downstairs. When the screaming suddenly stopped, she went downstairs to see what was going on, but when she got there, it was all quiet. Then she told the detective that she thought she had heard something outside, so she whipped around and looked out the door that opened into the backyard, and that was when she saw the terrifying thing that sent her running back up to her room and under her covers. Annie said she'd seen a very tall man with dark curly hair slowly walking away from their house. As she said this, Barr noticed Larry's eyes go wide, and then the boy started shaking his head. When Barr asked him what was wrong, Larry told him that the man Annie said she'd seen outside fit the description of their estranged brother, Michael, who was 6'4" tall and had dark curly hair. Detective Barr didn't know what to say. These poor kids who had finally found a safe and loving home with their adoptive parents had just lost that family and their new lives in a single day. Barr smiled at Annie and Larry and thanked them for their help. Then, leaving them there with the neighbors and the other officer who had brought them there, Detective Barr walked back outside and headed back across the street to the Swartz's house. As he walked, he knew one of his next moves would be to investigate his new primary suspect, Michael. Other than the bloody palm print, police had very little physical evidence from the scene of the crime. So, Barr and the other investigators began to question the Swartz's friends, families, and other associates to learn everything they could about the family. And through those conversations, Barr would learn that not long before Michael had left the house for good 4 years earlier, his outbursts with Bob had gone from just screaming fights to physical fights. And some of the neighbors were willing to admit that they thought Bob had most likely hit Michael on several occasions. And Barr also learned from a family friend that Michael had threatened to kill Kay and Bob, and that he had allegedly said that all he'd have to do was grab a knife and stab them. Barr knew that the threat of murder made Michael, who was already the prime suspect, look even more guilty, but Barr quickly discovered a major problem with the theory that Michael was the killer. Because Michael, who resided in a state mental hospital for psychiatric evaluation, had apparently been at the hospital on the night of the murders, at least according to hospital records. But Barr wasn't willing to take those records at face value. He wanted to meet with Michael in person because Michael simply had too many red flags to ignore. And so, days after the murder, Detective Barr drove out to pay Michael a visit at the mental hospital, which was a little over 10 miles away from the Swartz's house. When Barr arrived, a staff member from the hospital led him through the building, and Barr was horrified by the conditions he found. Screams from patients echoed from a large open room packed with beds. The floors and walls looked like they hadn't been cleaned in months, and Barr couldn't tell who, if anyone, was in charge of the place. He was also taken aback by how little security there seemed to be in the hospital. In fact, by the time he stepped into the room where he was supposed to meet Michael, he was convinced Michael could have easily slipped out of the hospital, made the relatively short trip to the Swartz's house, carried out the murders, and made it back to the hospital without anyone on staff ever noticing. Barr took a seat in a metal chair across a metal table from Michael. The room they were in was cramped, and the fluorescent light overhead cast a sickly glow on the dirty white walls. But Barr didn't notice any of that, because from the moment he sat down, he was fixated on Michael's neck. There were several red marks on one side of Michael's long, muscular neck, and so Barr asked Michael if he had gotten those marks in a fight. But Michael just grinned and told the detective the marks were actually hickeys that he'd gotten while making out with a girl he knew. Barr smiled back and then proceeded to tell Michael about what happened to his former adoptive parents. And Michael didn't seem remotely fazed by this horrible news. He just sat there calm as can be. But Detective Barr was experienced enough to know that Michael's reaction to what he was told was not necessarily proof of guilt or innocence. And so Barr began asking basic questions, starting with, where was Michael on the night Bob and Kay were killed, January 16th? And Michael's answer, which was delivered just as calmly as his reaction to the news about his former parents, was simple. He'd been right here in the hospital where the state of Maryland had put him. But Barr wasn't convinced Michael was being honest, so he leaned across the table, looked Michael right in the eyes, and pushed him to talk about his troubled relationship with his adoptive parents and the threats of violence he'd made against them in the past. Barr had hoped this approach might kind of rattle Michael and maybe get him to accidentally give something away, but this didn't happen. Michael stayed calm and stuck to his story. He had been at the hospital when they were killed, period. By the time Barr left the hospital, he was very frustrated. Between the hospital's obviously lax security and Michael's bizarre, nonchalant reaction and answers that he gave, it just seemed like Michael had to be lying, that he really had to be the killer. But without physical evidence from the crime scene or any kind of confession from Michael, Barr knew he was going to have to keep working to prove this theory. And not long after this initial meeting with Michael, Detective Barr's job got even harder. Because right after Barr left the mental hospital, Michael contacted a defense attorney who advised him not to speak with anyone from law enforcement about the murders of Kay and Bob Swartz. And so, a couple of days later, when Barr tried to set up another meeting with Michael at the hospital, he was refused. Now, Barr felt like he was running out of options, because in addition to not being able to speak to his primary suspect, he was still waiting to hear back from the FBI with the results of the tests they'd run on the bloody palm print. So, feeling like he was at a dead end, Barr went back to the drawing board and tried to find any other leads that might help him discover exactly what had happened to Kay and Bob. While investigators had been questioning people who were close to Kay and Bob, they discovered that, like Barr, most of these people thought Michael was probably the killer. But there was one person who investigators spoke to that offered a tip that sent Barr's investigation in an entirely new direction. A friend of the family informed Barr that Bob had been a staunch anti-abortion activist and that he had spent significant amounts of time publicly protesting an abortion clinic in the area. And it turned out that Bob's protests had often turned aggressive, and he'd possibly made some enemies in the process. So, Detective Barr did his job and tracked down people who worked at the clinic and some of Bob's fellow protesters. But as the days went by, he felt like this was all just a big distraction, and he didn't think this line of questioning was getting him any closer to solving the case. Because Detective Barr was sure that Michael must have at least been involved in the murders. So, Barr abandoned the abortion clinic theory and decided to just basically wait for the FBI to send back the test results from the bloody print that had been found on the sliding glass door at the murder scene. And finally, in March of 1984, almost 2 months after Bob and Kay were murdered, the results arrived. And as Detective Barr expected, these test results would break the case wide open. However, the results would lead Detective Barr down a path he had not even considered during his initial investigation. Based on the test results from the FBI, evidence found at the scene of the crime, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe took place at the Swartz home on the night Kay and Bob died, January 16th, 1984. At around 11:30 p.m. on January 16th, snow was on the ground outside the Swartz home and the temperature was well below freezing. But sweat dripped down the killer's forehead as they walked through the Swartz house towards the living room. The killer felt lightheaded, and they could still feel the slight burn in their stomach from the shots of rum they'd drunk only a few minutes earlier. The killer stopped a few feet from the living room, hidden in the shadows, and listened to the sound of the television. Then they poked their head around the corner and saw, in the glow of the TV, there was a woman wearing blue flannel pajamas, Kay, sitting in a black vinyl chair, watching the TV. In front of her was a small table with the remains of what looked like her late-night snack, an empty plate, a fork, and a sharp steak knife. The killer was not actually carrying a weapon. In reality, they had not fully mapped out how this attack would go, but the steak knife on Kay's table seemed like the perfect solution. So the killer took a few steps into the living room, but then suddenly stopped. And as they looked at Kay sitting there peacefully watching TV, they started to have second thoughts about what they were about to do. But then the killer took a long, deep breath and told themselves this was the right move. And then they continued to walk through the living room towards Kay. The killer's footsteps caused the wooden floors to creak as they moved. Kay heard those creaks and quickly looked up from the TV to see who was there. And when she saw, she was startled, but mostly she was angry, and she yelled something at the killer. And the killer shouted something right back. And then before Kay could possibly understand what was happening, the killer rushed forward, grabbed Kay's steak knife, and slashed the side of Kay's neck. Kay screamed, and the killer just froze, like they were stunned by what they'd just done. In that moment of hesitation, Kay put a hand to her neck to try to stop the bleeding, pulling herself out of her chair, and then she tried to run out of the room. But the killer, filled with rage, rushed after Kay and managed to slash her neck 6 more times. The killer watched her fall to the floor. Kay struggled to pull herself up onto her hands and knees, but she was now bleeding profusely and her breath was quiet and shallow. The killer stood over her, raised the knife again, and was about to bring it back down for one final blow when suddenly they heard a sound coming from the steps that led to the basement. The killer stopped what they were doing and rushed over to the top of the steps and looked down to see what the noise was, and what the killer saw at the foot of the stairs was Bob standing in the doorway of his basement office. And when Bob saw the killer standing there with the steak knife in hand, he screamed for help, but there was no help coming, and Bob had nowhere to go. He was trapped in the basement. Without hesitation, the killer walked down the stairs and tried to slash at Bob's face. But Bob, who was trying to back up, managed to throw his hands up to protect himself, and so the knife only cut into his hands. Bob managed to stumble back into his office, but the killer pursued, lunging at him again once inside and stabbing wildly at his neck. The strikes started to land, and before long Bob had fallen to the ground, at which point the killer stabbed him several more times in the chest before finally stopping and standing up. In total, Bob was stabbed 17 times, including blows that severed his left and right carotid arteries in his neck, which supply blood to the brain. Bob lay motionless on the floor of his office, with blood pooling all around him as he died. The killer stood there for a minute in a daze, gasping for breath and staring down at Bob's now dead body. But then the killer snapped out of it and remembered Kay might still be alive upstairs. So the killer ran out of Bob's office, back upstairs into the living room, and saw Kay was now gone. But the killer saw a path of blood on the floor that led out of the living room to the open sliding glass door that led to the backyard. Following the path of blood, the killer ran to the back of the house, where they slammed their hand on that glass door, which is how the bloody print was left, and then the killer stepped outside. The killer could see their own breath in the cold night air, and they could feel the snow crunch under their shoes, but the adrenaline made their face and hands feel flushed and hot. Then, in the moonlight, the killer saw Kay slowly staggering through the yard, desperately trying to get away. Blood dripped from her neck and left dark red pools behind her in the snow. Kay tried to scream for help, but the cuts from the killer's knife had damaged her neck and throat, and so she couldn't make enough sound to be heard. As the killer watched Kay moving through the yard, the urge to cause her as much pain as possible suddenly took over. The killer looked around the yard and spotted a wood-splitting maul, which is like a sledgehammer with a sharp axe head, leaning against a pile of firewood. Then the killer slipped the knife into their jeans pocket, walked over and grabbed the maul with both hands, and then ran over to Kay. When the killer reached her, she was barely able to stand. The killer raised the wood-splitting maul and slammed it into the back of Kay's head. Her skull cracked, and then she crumpled to the ground. Even though Kay was now dead, the killer was not done with her. They wanted to humiliate her. So the killer stripped Kay naked except for one sock. But after the killer tossed Kay's pajamas to the ground, they suddenly started to panic. It was like, for the first time, they realized what they had just done. The killer's hands were shaking, and they saw that their clothes were covered in blood, but they knew they had to get rid of the weapons, so they walked through the yard away from the house. They wiped down the handles of the maul and the knife with a clean part of their shirt, and then threw them into the woods that surrounded the Swartz's backyard. Then the killer walked back through the yard past Kay's body and went inside the Swartz's house. Once inside, the killer walked through the house to the laundry room where they stripped off their clothes, piled them into the washing machine, and then hit start. At this point, the killer's head was pounding, their arms and back ached, and they felt exhausted, so they walked upstairs, headed down the hall past Annie's room, and glanced at the door that led to Michael's old room. Then the killer stepped past that door to his own door that led to his bedroom, and he climbed into his own bed and went to sleep. Larry Swartz, who everybody thought was the quiet, sweet, perfect son, was in fact the killer. The results of the FBI tests made it clear that the bloody palm print on the sliding glass door belonged to Larry and not to Michael, like so many people had thought. And when Detective Barr learned the palm print was Larry's, he thought back to the beginning of his investigation when he first spoke to Larry and Annie right after he had arrived at the crime scene. And he would come to understand that little Annie thought of her 5'9" brother, Larry, as being a, quote, very tall person, because pretty much everyone who was over 5'5" seemed very tall to her. But Larry, thinking on his feet, had immediately used her description of the very tall man in the backyard, the likely killer, to his advantage, pointing out that his former brother, Michael, was in fact very tall, 6'4" to be exact, which is considered very tall by basically all adults. Michael did this, of course, to deflect suspicion away from himself. Police arrested Larry, and while in custody, he would confess to killing his parents. Larry claimed he had killed Kay in the house and had not chased her down and killed her in the yard like the police said. But Larry's memory of the night was fuzzy, and Detective Barr didn't think Larry's version of events fit with the evidence found in the backyard and in the house. But Barr did take Larry at his word when Larry explained why he had killed his parents. Larry said that once Michael had been kicked out of the house, he, Larry, became the target of Kay and Bob's very strict disciplinary tactics. They would yell at Larry constantly about his bad grades, ground him for weeks at a time, and keep him from going out on dates with the girl he liked. Larry grew very angry at his parents, and he felt like they enjoyed humiliating him. And then, on January 16th, 1984, Larry snapped. That night, after Annie had gone to bed, he and Kay got into a shouting match when he told her he had failed his Spanish exam. And Kay said that knowing Larry, he would probably fail all of his other exams too. So Larry stormed upstairs to his bedroom, slammed his door, reached under his bed, and grabbed a soda bottle that was actually filled with rum. And as he drank the rum, he got angrier at his parents, and he convinced himself that they were going to kick him out of the house like they'd done to Michael, and he'd never get to see his little sister Annie again. So Larry decided the only solution was to kill Kay and Bob. So he went downstairs and did just that. Larry ultimately pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison, but after serving 9 years, he was granted parole. Larry would move to Florida, where he would die from a heart attack in 2004 at the age of 38. Thank you for listening to the Mrballen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our YouTube channel. It's just called Mrballen, and we have hundreds and hundreds more stories on there, many of which are not available on this podcast. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your